I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Goldberg, here with Angela Russo-Otstot and Jessica Goldberg, who wrote the screenplay for Cherry, in which a former army medic suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder becomes a serial bank robber after an addiction to drugs puts him in debt. So guys, I was initially quite curious about how unconventional it was that you both took on adapting this very masculine story presented with a very particular level of specificity from a man's perspective. But once you see the film, you recognise how emotionally intelligent and universal it is. So what are your thoughts, Angela, on how you approached adapting this really muscular and specific narrative from your subjective point of view?
Yeah, I think our number one goal in adapting this was to mine compassion for this character's journey and experiences. We really made a concerted effort to walk the audience through his perspective and live, we say like live in his heart with him. And so the first step towards being able to do that for us felt like anchoring everything into a love story, which we crafted, which is slightly different from the book. And that sort of gave a pathway for us, and then also the audience, I think, to really hook in and stay on this journey with the character, even when things might get quite rough for him. So I think that was, sort of our compass was really mining empathy, which is quite universal.
Yeah, Jessica, what about you? Were you on the same wavelength?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's based on a book, of course, and there's so many themes in this book. The opioid crisis, war, post-traumatic stress. Like who among us hasn't been touched by these things right now? So there are things that have touched all of our families, all of our personal lives, people we know. So I don't feel like the gender was an issue, and there was going to be a ton of masculine energy in this story. So, in the first step, one of the first things, for the Russos, it was a very personal story. This was about where they grew up and lived, and together, Angela and I went to Cleveland and really walked through that place and felt that place, and I got a real intense sense of place, because place is so very important to the story. But I think that just we all carry these stories that are in Cherry in our lives, so it wasn't that hard to reach for.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me, and also I guess it also answers how you would adapt such a really dense and rich novel written by Nico Walker. How did you come about that novel when you decided to adapt it, Jessica?
Well, it was really the brothers and Angela. I had been working on them on something else with them, and I think, Angela can probably speak a little bit more to how they found the book, but they called me and I read this book, and it was poetic and unruly and wild and heartbreaking and incendiary, but it was about a very particular American experience that I think is pretty profound right now, and I just was so honored to be a part of it.
Yeah, Angela, what was the story like? How did you come about this novel?
The book was first introduced to my brothers by a book agent, and the connection of them being from Cleveland is what sparked this agent bringing the book to their attention, and thought that they might that the experiences described in it might resonate with them, because they happen to be from the exact pocket of Cleveland that a majority of the story takes place. And obviously I'm also from Cleveland, being part of their family, and they shared it with me. And I had the same, visceral connection to the people and places that in many ways felt emblematic of the people and places that had shaped us, even though our experiences happen to be so different from the narrators in the book. So that was when I was, first brought to the story by them. And I think also having lived there and still having so much of our family there in the Midwest, which seems to be, ground zero for this crisis and this epidemic. As Jess mentioned before, we've been touched by it in very personal ways. We still know people who are coping with their addiction. And so we felt a real need to tell this story because it's a topic that's not easy for people to embrace, and it's not easy to discuss. And I think something Nico Walker accomplished so incredibly well in his book was making these experiences be something that he could talk about with candor, even with humor, but also showing the raw vulnerability that comes with these experiences. And it just, was an incredibly empathetic character, as I said before.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a really compelling character, and a lot of what he goes through is really confronting. And it reminded me that we often hear about the plight of military veterans who struggle with trauma and assimilating integrate back into society. What was your key takeaway, Angela, from adapting Nico's story about the weight of that painful disconnect that is so common among veterans?
Yeah, I think, what's particularly interesting about this character and his experiences is that he goes into war carrying, certain challenges with him already in terms of mental health. He suffers from anxiety. So that certainly plays a role in his experience there. He's also sort of on a journey where he's becoming increasingly alienated by the world around him. And as he comes up against these various institutions, the Army being one of them, he's, more and more disillusioned and even damaged by them. And so once he exits, his experience in Iraq, he's carrying with him everything that existed on his journey beforehand and the trauma of the experience itself. And it felt like it's so tragic to us that there was no meaningful help. There was no defined course for him to take, a course of action to alleviate these challenges. And so that, I think, was something Jessica and I both spent a lot of time thinking about, how that manifests for him, what impact that has on his wife as well, and how it perhaps stirs up her own trauma and also ultimately contributes to her own addiction.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating, Jessica, how a lot of people carry trauma in various dimensions and elements and ways. This film is so adept at really reflecting on how it can damage someone's life so inextricably. What were your thoughts on the key takeaways about trauma?
I guess, what was so beautiful about this character is he's a poet, and he's a sensitive soul. He's also like a very critical soul of his environments. But, you put someone like that, you throw them into Iraq, you find out he's colorblind, he shouldn't really be a medic. He's like, out there with infantrymen doing a job. I think he's like 21 years old. And then he comes back, and there's that great scene in the movie where, he meets with the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says, "Have you heard of OxyContin?" And that's the help he gets. So it just, hearing Nico's story, which is a firsthand account of some, even though it's a work of fiction, it is, things he went through, and it's, and we definitely made the movie a work of fiction, but when you hear these stories, and from, we did a lot of research talking to other soldiers, and you just realize like what these people go through and how few resources there are for them when they get home. It really makes you want to do something about it.
Yeah. When you're writing a script like this and you are adapting it from a novel, I imagine there'd be a lot of internal debate about how faithful you have to be to the source material when adapting it. So how organic is that process, particularly when you've decided to diverge from it and add your own touches?
Yeah, I think, Cherry, while it's a truly remarkable book, it is more of a collection of experiences that don't necessarily present a dramatic propulsion. The character is engaged in an existential exercise, and it doesn't quite travel from here to here like you might want, to experience in the context of a film arc. So, we knew pretty immediately that we were going to have to sort of drastically create or shift some architecture And as I said before, we really focused on the love story when we did that, so that was our through line, and it served as the life preserver that can keep Cherry afloat through all of these experiences. And then I think, once we felt good about that, we went back to the book, and that's when, it became almost a series of science experiments. We would take bits from this character, or certain prose, the moments that really popped for us the first time that we read the novel, and you start sort of mixing them in different ways. And the goal is always to honor, the spirit of the book, like the beating heart that first compelled us to adapt it in the first place, and I think we tried very hard to make the film feel just like the book, even though it's actually quite different in many ways, and, necessarily so.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, that's so well said. It's I do think the film really captures the spirit of the book, and I feel, because you I mean, I love books, so I feel this incredible onus to translate everything, and you just get to a point where you realize you cannot do that, and you have to you're telling it in a totally different medium, and you have to figure out how to tell the story this way. But that spirit, that sort of I love that the movie has that the character talks to the audience, so you get his voice, and you get that sort of that the spirit of Cherry. I think that is truly what you try to capture.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you talked about the through line being that love story, because without spoiling it, it definitely is there in the beginning, the middle, and particularly the end. It's so gratifying and moving. So, final question before we wrap up is: the film does actually shift tonally quite a bit. It's quite heavy and confronting, but it's actually really funny. There's a couple of times where I laughed out loud. It was hilarious. How do you thread that needle to make sure that you're balancing the tonal shifts properly, Angela?
I mean, that was really inspired by the book, and the book is very funny, and it's tragically heartbreaking at the same time. And so we took our cue from that, really. And again, going into this with this mission of constantly honoring Cherry's perspective and the way that it's shifting through his journey, that led us on a really natural course to make a lot of the stylistic choices. The world is changing for him, and at certain times it's very absurd, and at certain times it's horrific. And so we made sure to step through every beat of the story from that perspective, from that individual that Jessica described before, who's this, this poet and so vulnerable, as we talked about. And that sort of led to tonal shifts. We experimented with genre. We made sure that we were portraying people and places exactly as Cherry might see them in the moment, or exactly as he can't see them in the moment. And that really, lent towards some of the more nuanced choices in terms of playing with rhythm and when to break the fourth wall, narration, things like that.
Yeah, and before we go, Jessica, anything further to add on that point?
No, I mean, that it was just, that was this character's voice. It was the way he saw the world. His social commentary is funny, and then it stabs you in the heart. So, hopefully, I think the movie does that as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for joining us today. We'll bring you back shortly for our panel discussion. It's going to be a good one.